We're about halfway into a 2-week discussion about reviving research to prevent gun violence. We're here to take stock of the conversation so far and to encourage people who watch this to participate. With me is a natural researcher into gun violence, Dr. Daniel Webster of Johns Hopkins, as well as 2 medical students who have been helping moderate the forum discussions. They are Elorm Avakame and David Eisenbray. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Dr. Webster, while you were doing your PhD studies, your mentors were doing work focused on the gun industry, and that seems to have caught your imagination. What impressed you about that?
Well, you know, when I was doing my doctoral studies, it was at the height of the epidemic of youth gun homicides that most of the conversation, or quite a deal of conversation at that time, focused on the role of crack cocaine in urban neighborhoods. But I was studying at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in East Baltimore, where really it was an epicenter of that problem.
Yeah.
I was mentored by Stephen Terrett in particular, who had a great interest and actually a track record of success on a number of injury-related problems in which his focus was what is the role of products and industry, and might there be opportunities in the case of gun violence to address a variety of kinds of problems within that industry. Now, Professor Terrett has been more focused on the design aspects of guns. I became particularly intrigued into the business of selling guns, and really have focused a great deal of my work on what you can consider sort of a point source in an environmental health problem.
Okay.
It turns out that there are a small number of gun dealers that really pump out the overwhelming majority of guns used in crime. So a lot of my research is focused on the retail sale component.
Okay. Can you give us a sense of the scale of the public health problem with gun violence?
Sure, it's enormous. Roughly 31,000 deaths a year through some type of firearm-related violence. The bulk of those, actually, 60% or more, are from suicides, and I think that is a particular part of the problem that many physicians have great opportunities for prevention. Around 11,000 deaths due to homicides, and the remaining, a relatively small share, but highly preventable types of deaths due to unintentional or accidental types of firearm injuries. Of course, there's also a great deal of non-fatal morbidity associated with gun violence, and what I think many people do not fully grasp is even the mental health component to this. There are many individuals living with a great deal of trauma, particularly in our inner cities, due to the pervasiveness of guns and gun violence.
Yeah. You know, I'm sitting in Boston, and Fenway Park holds about 31,000 people. And I don't know if you've been to Fenway Park before, but that's a lot of people when you look out on it, and that's an annual death toll from guns, 2/3, as you said, of whom are suicide, and 1/3 are homicides, and it's sobering. Go ahead, Daniel.
No, you're absolutely right. That definitely puts it in perspective, and I guess the one point that I will make here, particularly when it comes to homicide, is how unusual that is for the United States, a very high-income country, Western democracy. When you compare the United States compared to other high-income Western democracies, we're pretty average on almost every measure of violence and risk factor for violence, save one. And that is our homicide rate with guns is nearly 20 times higher than the average.
Mr. Avakame, you said in the forum, in your self-introduction, that you want a career in serving the adolescent population of Philadelphia, where you're from, I believe. What would you like to see studied in relation to gun violence that you think would help this group? And before you answer that question, I want to take note of the question that you posed this morning, an interesting one about, or late last night, about not treating all gun owners as a monolithic group. It was I thought it was an interesting question. So back to my original question. How would you like to serve the adolescent population in Philadelphia with this research?
Yes, thank you for that question. Again, this question that you're asking about the adolescents in Philadelphia is part of the larger question about different subgroups of gun owners. Yeah, and so it's my kind of sense that we don't have the best understanding of exactly why these young people. I mean, we have a kind of a broad sense and understanding that maybe there's some crime involved, some gang activity, etc. But I feel like in my own kind of studies, I'm hoping to bring more clarity to the reasons why and the meanings of and kind of the social meanings of gun ownership and the functions that firearms play in the lives, specifically in the lives of young people in inner city settings. So my hope is that not just for that subgroup, but for all the different kinds of subgroups of people, it stands to reason that different kinds of people, different groups of people are owning different kinds of guns and for different reasons. And I don't yet have the best sense of why the people group that I'm interested in, those young people that are disproportionately affected when we speak of interpersonal homicide, those deaths are more than likely young black males, and most of those young black males coming from impoverished backgrounds, concentrated in the inner cities of our country, as Dr. Webster can attest to based on his work in Baltimore. So, the long and the short of it is, I just am extremely curious about getting a kind of a granular understanding, as I said last night, of pertaining specifically to this group of people. What does owning a gun mean? What does the type of gun you own mean? How are the different ways? What are the different ways to understand gun ownership in this context? And then how can we effectively target our interventions as we think about how to reduce the burden of morbidity, mortality, and, as Dr. Webster so aptly pointed out, mental health trauma associated with gun violence, which again I want to underscore is a vastly underappreciated component of the problem. Not just those who die, but those who are left and those who witnessed living then with kind of the post-traumatic effects of those losses.
Mr. Eisenbrake, the Second Amendment begins a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, etc. And you yourself were a member of a well-regulated militia for 15 years. You were in the Air Force. Now that you're a medical student, what experiences from the military resonate with the question of research on gun violence to you?
Well, the biggest problem and I saw this first, was when Florida enacted its rule that basically gagged pediatricians from being able to even discuss gun ownership in the home with their patients and with new parents. I posted online to some of my friends about this and how I thought it wasn't really good and so on. One of my peers, who I'd known for 10 years, I'd flown with him. He was one of my co-pilots. We'd worked together for a long time. Came back very aggressively at me and was very upset about this discussion. And it was actually quite shocking. I had to engage him and say, okay, you know me, we've served together, we've flown together, we've been working together for, what's this aggressiveness? Why is this feeling so hard against it? For me personally, I mean, defending the Constitution, defending the rights of others is just part of, who I am. But I was not understanding to the depths of the people's passion towards that, and how how any hint at all of going against those passions and that feeling would basically bring up very aggressive and very negative feelings, like we're like removing their validation, removing their feelings. It made me start being aware that in order to be able to serve as a future physician, I needed to have a better understanding of where people are at, what the arguments are, what's going on with this. Personally, I have nothing wrong with guns. I enjoyed shooting. I have no problem shooting. I don't have any issue with that. But during my career, when I was a pilot, I was also a safety officer. So I did a lot of work with safety, industrial safety, home safety, and teaching people about safety. So as I progressed through my education and my master's degree, this was something that I paid attention to a lot. You were going to go ahead and say something.
I was going to say that I was a member of a well-regulated militia myself.
Oh, excellent.
And I carry around a copy of the Constitution with me in my bag, and I keep telling people that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. That people say, well, the Second Amendment allows you to rise up against the government, and I say, no, that's really not what the Second Amendment is talking about. But at any rate, when I left my well-regulated militia, I turned in my weapon, and I haven't missed it since. I mean, and I shot expert with it. So, but it's not, you know, it's I think it has to do with being a member of a militia, or the Constitution seems to think that it is important that it resonate with being a member of a militia, but that's not how the Supreme Court has interpreted it. So that's the end of my lecture.
I understand, and you know, this was one of my biggest arguments before the Supreme Court ruled, and basically that was my biggest argument I used with a lot of my peers while I was in the military about gun safety, gun ownership, and thinking about you know, how to manage guns in the home and so on. Then the Supreme Court went ahead and ruled the way it did, and that basically made it very difficult to use that as an argument. So now I've had to shift how I'm going about discussing this with my peers now, from, you know, what the Constitution says, to focus more instead on how can we be safe, how can you be safe in the home, and focus instead on approaching people where they're at. And that's been one of the things that I've been learning more about in medical school. Is it's not really about what you as a physician want. It's more about how do you approach it so that you can get the patient to meet the patient where they're at, and adjust those behaviors in a manner that's accepting of their culture, accepting of their internal behaviors, and such that they make the modifications themselves, not you coming in as a physician imposing it. That's been something that I've been learning a lot about, and actually I think that's going to be more relevant for us physicians and for making the public health campaigns and challenges in the future, is going to be figuring out where we can make those modifications such that the culture itself accepts and adopts those modifications. Somebody mentioned, I think it was actually Dr. Webster, said something about the suicide reduction, and going and talking to the gun shop owners and trying to work through it that way, and trying to enact a legislation that was supported by the gun store owners to reduce suicides by putting some timing in there such that they weren't immediately getting a gun and going and committing suicide.
Yeah,
you know, those types of interactions. Sorry.
There was an article yesterday, Dr. Webster, in The Guardian, and it was about smart weapons, and there was a suggestion that the police departments across the country should buy smart weapons that could be used only by the officer in control of the gun, or that officer's partners or partner. Mm-hmm. And it was posited as a way for smart weapons to become more acceptable in the society. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think it's an excellent idea. I think that law enforcement are going to need to be won over on this. I know that they are understandably cautious. So the weapon is obviously something central to their line of work and their personal safety, and so I'm sure there's going to have to be a process of getting law enforcement officers comfortable with the technology. I do think it's an excellent idea, though, to for this as an entry point, for this to become more normalized. Right now, there's a lot of misinformation, I think, about smart weapons that circulates on the internet to various gun groups, and so I thought it was an excellent idea, but it's will take a little while.
Yeah. Mr. Avakame, there was I have a question actually for all of you, but I want to address it to you first. Have we become afraid to talk about guns? My sense is that the NRA has such political power with the major parties and other organizations that questioning the Second Amendment's wisdom in the 21st century is akin to some sort of crime in itself, even after Sandy Hook. Do you get that sense at all?
Yeah, I do, and to me, I mean, it's interesting to note the amount of kind of political power and pressure that groups like the NRA can exert in dominating the national conversation. I mean, we saw the way that that kind of dynamic interfered with the Surgeon General's appointment, just recently.
Yeah.
And as if the Surgeon General of the United States should not say that firearm-related morbidity and mortality is a major public health issue, when the data clearly show that it is. So it's interesting to see again. Like I think I agree with you, Mr. Elliott, that it seems that we have become wary of broaching that topic, and I think part of it goes back to what David shared, that the conversations about gun ownership and about regulation and legislation and about the kind of the burden of morbidity and mortality that we're experiencing are touchy conversations to have, and are often emotionally loaded from both sides, where neither side people on either side can't see how people can think differently, and so there breeds this conflict that makes it kind of worth avoiding altogether. So now I think gun ownership is part of that category of things you don't talk about at dinner, including religion and politics. Right? So this is the gun ownership has become a part of that now triad. I think going forward, it's important for us to figure out, and I don't remember exactly who posed this question. The answer yesterday to David's question, but it's important for us to figure out how to engage open-minded gun owners, people who are enjoy their sport, their craft, or whatever it is that they use their weapons for, but also understanding of the fact that more regulation or figuring out how we can have less people die is not a bad thing. And I think kind of reaching those moderate voices will begin to kind of turn the tide here as far as just being able to have conversations about these things. I think, though, again, speaking from the perspective of someone who is concerned about these problems, I know that there's a tendency for us to speak kind of condescendingly of those who are, in the pro-gun majority. And I think that in itself is extremely off-putting, and it's something that we need to be self-critical of, something that we need to kind of make sure we are checking ourselves on, because there's no way I'm going to be able to engage someone who is passionate about these issues, just passionate in the opposite kind of direction than I am, when I'm acting as if to hold that view is to be like, some kind of imbecile. So I think we both have, there's work to do on both sides of the fence there as far as finding a middle ground to have the conversation at least.
I feel it's really important to echo a comment. I'm sorry to jump in here, but
no, I was going to ask you. Go ahead.
The thing I wanted to say is that if you think about it too, we talk about sexual issues with our patients. We talk about drug use with our patients. We talk about suicide with our patients. We talk about all these different very hard texts that are things that normally, even like abortion, normally not are very polarizing. Okay, but we come to them in a non-judgmental manner, and that in that way we're able to discuss them. And I think that that's what Alarm is espousing, is saying, you know, look, we can talk about these things. We just need to find a way to not go about it in a polarizing manner when we go about it, and not be judgmental when we go about it. And I think we can engage. I think that overall, I think that we're not going to be able to discuss, I think, perception of the Second Amendment and a perception of gun ownership is not something that's going to shift within the next 100 years, possibly. It's going to take time to shift how people think about it, if that's the ultimate goal. I think the most important thing now is just to engage people, like Lorna said, you know, in a non-polarizing discussion, find ways to work around it, and start getting moving forward with the discussion of where we need to be with guns.
I just want to point out that if we didn't change things for 100 years, there would be some 3 million people, 1 million of whom would have been victims of homicide, and 2 million of whom would have committed suicide. So I would think we have to act faster than that.
I agree. I agree with the making the alterations. I think the perception of the Constitution, the way it stands, may not shift, but we may be able to make the underlying changes such that in some time that might shift.
Yeah, there was a you opened with an anecdote about talking about the Florida statute that says you can't talk about guns with patients. Because it's, I guess the argument is it's the Second Amendment. It's a constitutionally protected right, and you can't question it. But there's an earlier amendment called the First Amendment,
Yes,
saying that Congress shall make no law regarding freedom of speech or of the press. So I guess the states have taken it upon themselves to make the laws, and Congress is out of the loop on this. I don't know. Dr. Webster, what are you researching right now? What's your? I guess you can't divulge your results early, but what are the things that have got you by the throat, as it were?
Okay. Well, currently, one of the policy areas that we're looking at very closely is the relationship between various kinds of background check requirements, background check laws, and their impact on both homicide and suicide. The type of policy we focused on most recently to, in essence, effectuate a background check are state laws requiring permits for individuals who want to purchase handguns. We published research roughly a year ago showing a pretty substantial increase in homicides when Missouri repealed its permit to purchase for handguns. We've just completed a study showing some sort of a mirror image of that when Connecticut adopted a very similar type of permit to purchase law that Missouri repealed. When it had adopted this law back dating to 1995, we've documented a significant reduction in firearm homicides associated with that law. It's also very consistent with research that we've done showing both that these types of policies reduce the diversion of guns to criminals, and looking at a large database of surveys of people incarcerated in state prisons for committing crimes with guns, and looking at violent criminals and whether they use guns when they commit their crimes. We find that in states that have these types of measures, a permit to purchase system, you have far fewer violent offenders using guns to commit violence. And even when they do access guns, they almost always do it through an underground gun market that the gun trace data show those guns principally come from outside the state. So all of these different types of data sort of converge to indicate that that sort of goes against some of the general wisdom that the gun lobby tries to promote, which is it's impossible to keep guns from dangerous people. Well, it's not easy, but there are policies in place that do make it far more difficult for dangerous people to get guns. And as a result, we have lower homicide rates. And we're also looking at the effect of these policies on suicides. The effects right now that we're seeing aren't nearly as large as what we're seeing on homicides, but certainly point in the direction of fewer suicides when these types of policies are in place.
Well, as I said at the beginning, we're halfway into a 2-week discussion on this, and I want to encourage people who may be watching this to go and participate on the MedStro open forum discussion. I want to thank you, Dr. Webster, and you, Mr. Avakame, and Mr. Eisenbray, for having this discussion with us. And it's an important one. And thank you again for your time today.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you.